Today we are going to take one more step down the track to that elusive PhD in ghetto engineering. We're going to talk combustion dynamics, and then we're going to shift laterally and cover off a subject which I'm calling, working title, magnetic induction for politicians and other imbeciles. There's a tool review today as well, which is this baby, which at first glance might just be a prototypical lightsaber, but which is actually a handheld 1000 watt electromagnetic induction furnace. Who doesn't want one of those? I know I do every time I want to get into the engine bay of a car and work on a stuck fastener without burning the joint down. I think it's fair to say that we all want that. Ditto if you're getting under some large item of yard equipment like a ride-on lawnmower and you want to work on a stuck fastener under there without burning the joint down. These things are a fantastic alternative to the propane torch for exactly that reason. So that's all coming up. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au. New cars cheap, but Australia only. Website. Card. Magnetic induction is like the frickin' Matrix, dude. It's everywhere. It's hidden in plain sight. You know, you're driving up and down the street and you see those transformers on poles. What they do is they get high voltage transmission type electricity down to 230 volts AC for homes and businesses, right? And they only work by virtue of magnetic induction, which is a miracle. And if you've ever gone to Bunnings and walked away with a cheap ass saw, not unlike this baby, or the ones with the orange handles, which are ubiquitous also, they are hardened by magnetic induction. You can even see the heat affected zone on the teeth, which is kind of cool. So these things roll down the production line. They've got a magnetic induction furnace that just gets the teeth, and only the teeth, to the Goldilocks temperature, which is probably about, 800 degrees C, briefly, and then they chill it rapidly, or rapidly enough to harden it up, with probably air in a production environment, I'd suggest. And they even temper it, because you can see that it's been tempered back to that blue colour to just make the teeth a little tougher and a little less brittle. Knock the hardness back a bit, but really pump up the toughness. So that's an example of that. If you ever watch Cutting Edge Engineering Australia, starring Curtis, you'll see him machining a thing, raw stock, that he gets in called induction hardened chrome bar, which is the kind of thing that you would use on a cylinder rod for a ginormous bulldozer's hydraulic cylinder, okay? And it would be a steel like, I guess, 4140, something like that. And they harden just the outside of that with magnetic induction in the same sort of way as the saw. And when you see Curtis work on that, he's got to use ceramic inserts to get through the hard layer, because the ceramic insert is harder even than a tungsten carbide insert. And when he chops through that 2 or 3 millimeters, he can go back to tungsten carbide. So you probably use magnetic induction when you drop your phone onto the wireless charging pad in your car, or if you've got a smartwatch and you've got the magnet thing that clips on the back, magnetic induction. It works like this, okay? You connect this to 240, 230 volt electricity. Everyone calls it 240. It's actually 230 plus or minus 15% or something. And what happens basically with magnetic induction is if you connect a copper coil, not unlike this baby that comes in the kit with your heater, furnace, whatever, if you connect that to 230, which I would strongly suggest not doing in the PowerPoint, that can only end badly. But if you do, what happens is the coil generates a magnetic field like a solenoid, right? And because it's AC and it's shifting backwards and forwards polarity-wise 50 times a second, the magnetic field goes one way and then rapidly reverses for the whole time that the power is connected. And if you stick something ferromagnetic, like a piece of steel, inside the coil, the magnetism goes to work on it by, let's call it molecular friction, and heats the thing up, and it's very effective, and there's not much waste heat radiated around the whole jigger, and that is the beauty of this system. Like with a lot of magnetic induction devices, like a transformer, the waste heat is just a problem, and that's why they got to have cooling fins and things of that nature and operate in an oil bath or however they manage the heat. But with a heater, like a heating coil that uses this mechanism, the waste heat is actually what you're after. So I guess what we should do here, the first thing I should say is if you want to heat up aluminium or brass or copper, it's not going to help, okay? You really need only to use these on ferromagnetic things like steel fasteners or something. Now, I better show you this unit in operation, okay? It's 1,000 watts. It's really simple to use. The coils just go on like this, and there's 10 of them in the kit. The kit comes in this bag, box, whatever case. You get 10 coils. You get 2 of these relatively large 50mm ones. You get 2 40s. You get two 30s. The 30 is in the machine at the moment. You get 2 of these flat ones, which are like heating pads, so you can hold the coil up against something to loosen up a sticker or something of that nature if you just want to scrape it off. And then you get 2 of these, which are as yet unformed, and you can bend them around and, you know, make whatever shape coil you need for whatever particular job you're doing. So that's what you get. It's about $330. If you flog the machine and you wear out the coils, you can buy a set of 8 for about under $40, I'm going to say, from Vivor's website today on sale. I'll have links to all that in the description and a code for 5% off. So anyway, you can decide whether one of these sorts of things will be beneficial or not, but I guess I should show you in use, because if you've got a fastener that's just stuck there, let's just say you've got a stud coming out of some item of equipment like this, and it's got a washer and a nut on it. It's been there since the dawn of time. Maybe it's on the disc of a lawnmower. Okay, so it's been shot peened by a billion stones that you've rolled over, and it's rusty, and someone put it on with green Loctite. So we've ticked every hard to get off box, right? So let's just demonstrate the unit in operation. Now, if you're ever going to apply heat, you don't know how the part's going to react, something might break. Safety specs, not optional. Not these things either. I mean, these things are okay if you just want to see what you're doing, but they're not protective enough. So you need proper safety specs to do this kind of work. And the thing about eyes, of course, 2 per customer for life. So you can't afford to get this wrong once, in other words. So the coil's in, the bayonet's on, she's plugged in, you hit the red button, it starts with the magnetism. Pro tip, do not invoke the power without the thing you want to heat being in the coil. You shouldn't do it without a load. So basically it's just a matter of getting the coil down near the part and boom. It's fan cooled, so it might take a while to get initially something started here, but you can see the paint starting to oxidize and smoke up here. So we are getting a bit hot, which is always nice. And basically lost most of the paint now. There's a 2-minute maximum operation time. The unit itself is thermally protected, so it will shut itself down if you overcook it. And just to remember, if you start seeing a change in colour, like if you start seeing the full-on red glow on something, that's probably 550 to 600 degrees C. And you're probably going to start affecting the heat treatment of the fastener if it's a high tensile fastener after that. But you can see there that the paint has basically oxidized itself away. And you know, we've got quite a bit of heat action happening on that fastener now. The insulation on the coils is not impervious to the heat, but it does a pretty good job resisting it for an extended period of time, and you could easily cook an egg on that or damage yourself badly if you forget that it's hot. So it is quite effective and quite fast, and the thing about it is nothing around here is even vaguely warm. Like I can just touch everything on this plate that is not just the pipe's a bit hot, but the fastener itself is really hot, okay? And that is the beauty of this system, because in this situation, when you want to free up the rust and you want to, if the Loctite's been used, you want to overcook the Loctite and bake it off, basically. And then you want to use thermal expansion as well of the nut on the stud or the bolt into whatever it's going into. Then you don't want, in the engine bay of a car, the last thing you want is heat washing everywhere, because you've got everything you need for a disaster in the engine bay of a car. You've got fuel and flammables, and if you introduce a source of ignition, which this is not, incidentally, this is not so much a source of ignition, although you could get something up to the auto ignition temperature of the wiring, the insulation on the wiring of a car, or certainly up to the auto ignition temperature of the fuel. But you don't have a spark, you don't have a source of ignition per se, and you certainly don't have waves of heat washing all over the place. So the reason I would use this is because it's much safer than the alternative, which would be propane. So maybe we should talk about the case for propane and the combustion dynamics of propane, because propane's accessible, lots of people have got propane. It's pretty normal for somebody to have a cylinder like this, and maybe the yellow one with the MAP gas in it, which is a little quote-unquote hotter, you know? But I would suggest that with a propane cylinder like this, I don't think that is 1,000 watts, you know? And if you wanted to heat this, it's going to take forever, you know? And there's going to be so much heat that's just washing away into the plate over time that it's just not enough heat coming out of the torch to be useful in the context of using it for anything over about M6. You know, it's just, a cylinder like this is not helpful, but this is only the entry level of propane, for example. The next step up is probably something like this, which you connect directly to a barbecue gas bottle, you know, like an LPG cylinder. So you don't connect it directly, you actually use a regulator, obviously, but it's basically just a direct connection over to a barbecue gas bottle. And if you are going to do something like this, then the first thing you really should do is get a nice long hose, 3 or 4 meters long, and that means you've got the bottle 3 or 4 meters away from where you're doing the work. That's kind of important. Basically, these things are quite easy to use. They've got a sort of idle and on function with the jet. I'll show you. So you can see that, well, you probably can't see it, but you can certainly hear it. And then when you hit the torch, it just injects more propane. And you can tune the flame up or down, right? So that's probably pretty good for heating. And then, of course, if you turn it the wrong way because you're not looking at it and it's the reverse rotation, so the thing about this, right, is that you can see, you might not be able to see the flame, but you can hear how hard it roars, right? That's more than enough to heat this fastener up. But you think about the amount of heat that's coming off the end of the tube. So it's 60 degrees C out here because I can't keep my hand on that, and that's pretty much the cut-off temperature for skin tolerance, right? 60 degrees C, it's how baristas do the coffee, you know? So you get closer to the torch and it gets really hot, and if you're doing this, there's a lot of heat blowing everywhere, and that's why propane is freaking useless for anything of this nature in a combustible environment like the engine bay of a car. You've got a fuel system inside the engine bay of a car, and you've got oil, and you might have sprayed WD-40 all over a bunch of stuff, and there's lots of flammables, and there's also likely to be vapor coming off. So if you unwittingly are talking to a camera or just working on something and you put the torch over here and you start heating up the fuel line, then that's a freaking disaster, or anything else that's likely to burn. So that's a risk that has to be very carefully managed as well if you're going to use propane. But if you've got a stuck fastener and you're into it like that and waste heat is blowing everywhere, that's okay if you're working on something that's in a completely inert kind of environment, like you're just working on a flange, like a flange on a pipe fitting or something that's been removed and it's on a vise on a steel bench and nothing can burn, then yeah, knock yourself out. But in the engine bay, getting into it with the heat like that is, in my view at least, really quite dangerous. It's more dangerous in a sense to use propane than it is to use oxyacetylene or oxypropane, because of the combustion dynamics of propane, right? So think about it like this. Propane torches don't stop there. You can get a propane torch like this, and if you think about it like an engineer or a scientist, what you're really looking at there is a hell of a big set of air intakes, because there's a little tiny hole coming out of the propane delivery pipe itself, and you've got these comparatively massive areas that have been specifically carved in here to allow air to come in. Basically, air gets sucked through. The flame starts in here. The expansion comes out this way. It creates suction in here that pulls enough air in to do a reasonable job burning the propane. And all of these propane air torches are kind of like this. That's a little bit of a novel design. You don't see this one as much. You typically see a small hole in the guts for the gaseous propane. Like in the bottle is liquid propane, LPG, liquefied propane gas, okay? But when you open the tap, the liquid in the gas bottle boils, right? It's just like boiling an egg, that type of boiling. Gas comes off, albeit at room temperature, and that's what comes out of the pipe. You get gas coming up the pipe through the fitting, you hit the trigger, more gas comes out, and these four holes here, they're the air intake. They're much bigger than the hole in here, which is, by the look of things, less than 1 millimetre, right? And you've got these comparatively big holes here that the air gets sucked through. There's a point to this, right? You see, an even bigger propane torch has the same sort of arrangement. The hole in the guts here is probably 2 millimetres or so, but the hole for the air is substantially bigger, right? And basically the limitation with a propane torch, they're good for heating, they're good for killing weeds, they're good for heating up something, like preheating something that you're going to weld. They're really good at that. And you don't need to go to the expense of having an oxygen tank, like for oxypropane heating and cutting, okay? But if you're just using a straight air propane setup, like this baby here or these other two, you're basically stuffed, because air is 78% nitrogen gas, and nitrogen gas doesn't burn, doesn't help the combustion process. Only the 21% of air, which is oxygen gas, helps the combustion. So 78% of what goes into these holes here does not help. But it gets spectacularly warmed up by the fire on the way through. And what it leads to is a lot of heat being washed all over everything, much more than if you were just going to use oxypropane, for example. Okay? If you're just going to use oxypropane, then you're feeding pure oxygen into the propane, and that's not as hard. The designers of anything that runs combustion in air have a big problem, and it's not getting the fuel in. This applies to your car, it applies to this propane torch, it applies to a furnace that you melt steel in, okay? It's easy to get the fuel in. You can deliver a shit ton of coal. It's getting the air in to burn it efficiently. That is the problem. So when you do this kind of thing in an engine bay, you end up with, superheated is the wrong term, but you end up with really hot nitrogen gas that blows everywhere. There's a lot of sort of exhaust that just blows out everywhere, and it's really hot, and it can damage things and melt things and start fires. And you have to be really careful about the environment in which you use that, which is why I'd suggest that if you use something like this in the context of automotive restoration, when there are numerous hard to get at fasteners and you might have an engine bay only partly pulled down, so there's maybe a short motor inside the engine bay and you've got to strip it down, you're trying to get the exhaust manifolds off or something of that nature, then they're likely to be hard because they've probably corroded, they've been through heaps of temperature cycles, they get really hot, and they're going to be hard to undo, and you really don't want to break one off. So some heat is a great idea, but by the same token, burning the garage down sucks, which is why I feel that a device like this is just so much safer. So if that doesn't work, okay, because what I really want to do here is not just show you the cool toys and talk about the theory, but think about applying it. What are we going to do, right? So if we apply the heat and it doesn't work, obviously go again. Maybe do it 3 times and then wait for it to cool down and spray some penetrating oil all over it and let it soak for a while, and maybe get your trusty brass hammer out and give it a bit of persuasion, just a bit of shock treatment. You could even use something like this. This brass tooling is really useful if you're ever coming to grips with a properly stuck fastener, because it doesn't do as much damage to whatever you're hitting as a steel punch will, particularly because most steel punches are hardened and you can damage whatever. Now, it's a good idea if it's a nut, you can hit it radially and then go 2 flats over and hit it radially again, and that can have a pretty positive effect on the battle that you are fighting, particularly if there's corrosion or Loctite or something in play, so a bit of shock helps. And then you can upset the tensile and compressive forces in the bolt by hitting longitudinally as well. And obviously if you ever hit this sort of thing for real with a hammer, wear your safety specs, because stuff can break off and you don't want it to Murphy's Law you in the eye, and it's particularly galling if you injure yourself and your safety specs are up here. So if that doesn't work and you're still kind of stuck, then what do? Well, if it's a nut, you could have a crack with something like this, which is unsurprisingly called a nut splitter. So if you're a politician, I should tell you that this is designed to split a nut that you can't get undone any other way, and it's a pretty easy way to do it when you think about it, because if you get into this with an angle grinder or you try to plasma gouge it or something of that nature, you're likely to damage the bolt, like the stud that might be coming out. And there's a case to be put that you should just replace the stud. If you've got to go to this much trouble to undo something, then yeah, maybe just replace the stud. But hey, if you want to retain it for whatever reason, then a nut splitter is a really good way to do it. So we might just do that now, even though this fastener is not actually stuck and I've just rigged it up here to use as a bit of a demo. So the cool thing about a nut splitter is that it's not a high kinetic energy kind of tool, but the fastener itself might let go with a little bit of shrapnel. There's not much likelihood of that, but realistically, you don't want to roll that dice. So I'm more of a fan of wearing safety specs, even if I don't need them, than waiting for somebody to invent the time machine so that I can go back in time and put them on in case I did. So with these babies, these are awesome too, these Knipex Pliers wrench. They're fantastic because when you connect them like this, the jaws on the pliers are parallel. They don't mar up the nut like the hex. And the tighter you grip them, the tighter you pull, the tighter the wrench gets. So they're really well thought out like that. And the hardened points, just like a cold chisel, on the point there that we're driving into the nut. And if I can find another similar fastener, I'll do this and show you an up close version as well, but not exactly busting a gut here and making some pretty good progress. It looks to me like about a 1mm pitch on the thread here, so it's a pretty fine thread, but we're going, there we go. You can feel yourself walking up the stress strain curve of the nut, and there, just let go. So basically that's a done deal, and once you've got the nut split, you should just be able to get let a little bit of this tension off. And I'll just show you exactly where we're at with that. So essentially in that situation, if you've let that much tension off the nut, you should just be able to get anything onto it then and just undo it, and if it's not too hot, you might even be able to touch it. But if you can't, of course, you can always just grab the nut splitter and have a crack at it 180 degrees away, like on the flat on the other side, and then you'll just physically split it in half. And its capacity to resist is very limited. You can see what we did there is basically just split that little bit of the hex. And if that doesn't fix up whatever's giving you a problem, then nothing else will. And you can tell here that the thread itself is completely undamaged. And so that's kind of what I got for you. Incidentally, I got the nut splitters from Trade Tools as well. They come in a set of 4, so they from really, really small to, you know, really, really significant. Not Curtis spec nut splitter, obviously, but he just carve an arc, gouge the crap out of it. He's a maestro with that thing. He could carve the statue of David with a bloody carbon arc gouger. Not sure I want to have a crack at that long term. Not sure it's so good for your health, but it's pretty magic to see him doing it. Anyway, you can get home ghetto engineering spec set of nut splitters, and they might be a real asset too. But what I wanted to sort of prove to you today is that you can come to grips with this sort of stuff in the home shared ghetto engineering environment. Fasteners can be monumentally stark. Like that, it can be a real battle. It can be a war of attrition, UV fastener, right? But with a bit of heat, with a bit of mechanical shock, you know, and in extremis with some, you know, really cleverly designed compressive load and some basic hand tools, you can do a kick-ass job getting yourself out of strife, and the risk of burning the joint to the ground is pretty limited. And you don't have to, you don't have to resort to something as ham-fisted as this in the engine bay, in my view. You know, if you're a seasoned professional, you wear overalls every day and you come to grips with this sort of stuff every day, you know where you can use propane, you know where you can use oxypropane. You've probably got a very systematic approach to safety in your environment, and you even know when you can push the envelope a little bit one way or the other, because you could, for example, use a propane torch in some situations in conjunction with, wait for it, you might be able to insulate the odd thing that's a bit vulnerable with one of these babies, which is a fiberglass welding blanket. It's not meant to insulate something from 1,000 degrees of thermal input. It's meant to stop BBs from welding, from falling onto fuel lines and things of that nature. But if you were that dude in overalls and you wanted to push the envelope a little bit and you knew that this thing over here was a bit of a risk because of the waves of heat coming off from blowing it in that direction, then a few layers of welding blanket might just be enough to tip the balance in your favour. But I think if you're doing something for the first time, then the most systematic way to make sure that you don't burn the joint down or wake up in the burns unit or blow yourself up or anything else of that nature is to choose the safest option first, which would be something with nearly no waste heat, which just heats a fastener up Goldilocks, you know? And then you don't have to come to grips with all of those risks. So anyway, link in the description for that if you think this sort of thing would be useful for you. Seems like a pretty good tool to me. I don't think it's the sort of thing that many people would use every day or even every weekend. But if you do have that restoration project and you know you're going to have to come to grips with 1,000 rusted fasteners and it's going to be a bit of a bastard in some situations, then an induction heater like that and some cool tools that most people don't own could really help. And, you know, then you can be happy with yourself, right? Because you can look at a job and you can say, yeah, I won. And most people would have folded halfway through the battle. So there's that. Let me know if you'd like to see more of this ghetto engineering DIY stuff. Like, would take the sort of things people learn in a trade environment, like fitting and boiler making, welding, all of that stuff, and a bit of machining, bit of ghetto machining at least, and just nudge it into shape so it fits into the shed at home. If you want to see more of that stuff, let me know. I've tried not to inflict too much of my hobby on you and just concentrate more on the whole pure automotive thing. But if you want some more of that, a bit more welding, a bit more heat treatment, a bit more cool tools, maybe we can talk about precision drilling through steel, how to cut steel like butter, that kind of stuff. Let me know. I'll read those comments with interest and then I'll disregard all of them and just do, as usual, whatever the hell I feel like doing.